Out on a sun-scorched trail where even hope dries up before noon, a young widow rides alone with nothing but grief, a dying horse, and a secret buried deeper than the desert itself. 2 days ago, she buried her husband. Today she might bury herself. But when a stranger appears through the heat haze, she must choose, trust, or pull the trigger. And that choice will change not only her fate, but the destiny of an entire land. Stay with me, because what begins as a journey of survival will soon turn into a fight for life, love, and something far more powerful than fear.
The wagon wheels didn't just turn. They groaned, a rhythmic soul-crushing sound of dry wood protesting against the rutted California earth. To Josephine Bennett, it sounded like a funeral dirge played on a splintering violin. It was the spring of 1887, but the desert didn't care for the calendar of men. The air was a heavy, suffocating blanket of heat that shimmered over the sagebrush, turning the distant horizon into a wavering mirage. Josephine sat on the hard bench, her hands, once soft, now mapped with blisters and sunscorch, clutching the reins with a white-knuckled grip. She was 22 years old, and she was a ghost in a calico dress. Behind her, the canvas cover of the wagon flapped weakly in the hot breeze like the wing of a dying bird. Inside was the sum total of a ruined life, a single trunk of clothes, a water barrel that rang hollow when tapped, and a small, heavy pouch of seeds hidden at the bottom of her sewing kit, the only thing Thomas hadn't sold before the end. Thomas. 2 days ago, she had dug into the rocky soil with a broken shovel in her bare hands. A rattlesnake bite had taken him in hours, turning her sturdy, dreaming husband into a memory beneath a pile of stones. She had traded their farming equipment for a doctor who arrived too late and a coffin that cost more than the wood was worth. Now she had $17, a dying mare in the traces, and a grief so vast it threatened to swallow the sun. She didn't know how long she had been weeping until the sound of hoofbeats cut through the haze of her sorrow. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. A woman alone on the trail was not just a tragedy. She was prey. Her hand moved instinctively to the wagon bed behind her, fingers brushing the cold iron of the Winchester rifle Thomas had taught her to handle. A rider approached from the east. He was a dark silhouette against the blinding glare, his shape wavering in the heat. He didn't approach at a gallop, the mark of a raider, but at a steady, respectful walk. Still, Josephine's throat went dry. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. He rode a sturdy buckskin gelding that moved with easy power. The man wore a dusty brown Stetson pulled low, a faded blue shirt stained with salt and trail grit, and leather chaps that had seen years of hard use. He looked like the landscape itself, rugged, weathered, and indifferent. "Madam," he called out, his voice a low rumble that carried across the scrub. He reined in his horse about 20 yards away, a distance meant to soothe. But Josephine only felt the prickle of terror on her neck. "Stay where you are," she shouted, her voice cracking. The cowboy pushed his hat back, revealing a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so tired. His eyes were a startling blue-green, the color of a river she'd likely never see again. He held up his hands, palms open. "Easy now. I saw your tracks. They're wobbling pretty bad, and your mare looks about ready to drop. My name's Harrison Trent. I work the Thompson place about 15 miles back." "I don't care who you are or where you work," Josephine hissed. She reached back and hauled the Winchester onto her lap. "Keep riding, Mr. Trent. I've got nothing left for anyone to take." Harrison didn't move. His gaze swept over the lone wagon, the empty horizon, and the red-rimmed eyes of the woman holding the gun. A flicker of something, not pity, but a deep, somber understanding, crossed his face. "I can see you've had a hard run of it, Mrs. Bennett. I'm guessing that's the name on the side of your trunk. But you're sitting in bandit country with a horse that won't make it another 3 miles. I can't in good conscience leave a lady to the coyotes." "I am managing," she cried, the lie burning her throat. "Begging your pardon, madam. "But you aren't managing much at all," he said quietly. He nudged his horse forward a single step. The movement snapped the last thread of Josephine's composure. The grief, the heat, and the sheer terrifying weight of her loneliness converged into a single point of desperation. She didn't mean to, not really, but her finger, trembling and slick with sweat, tightened on the trigger. Crack! The rifle kicked into her shoulder, a bruising jolt. The bullet whistled through the air, but it didn't find its mark. In a blur of motion that seemed impossible for a man so relaxed, Harrison had leaned low in his saddle, and his hand had whipped out a coil of lariat. As the shot rang out, the loop of his rope hissed through the air like a snake, catching the barrel of the Winchester just as the recoil sent it upward. With a sharp tug, he yanked the barrel toward the sky. The second shot, if there had been one, would have hit the clouds. The silence that followed was deafening. The smell of burnt gunpowder hung in the stagnant air. Josephine stared at him, her chest heaving, the rifle now uselessly tangled in his rope. Harrison didn't draw his own sidearm. He didn't even look angry. He slowly coiled his rope back in, bringing the rifle barrel down safely. "That's a fine way to say hello," he said, his voice as steady as the earth. "But you missed, Josephine. And lucky for both of us, I'm a hard man to kill." He dismounted then, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, giving her every chance to see he wasn't coming to hurt her. He walked to the head of her mare, who was hanging her head in exhaustion. "You're a widow as of 2 days ago, aren't you?" he asked softly, not looking at her, but at the horse. "I saw the fresh stones back a bit. I'm real sorry for your loss." The fight went out of her all at once. The rifle slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. She collapsed back onto the bench, burying her face in her hands as the hot, bitter tears finally broke through. "I have nothing," she sobbed. "I have nowhere to go." Harrison stood by the mare, his hand resting gently on the animal's neck. He looked out at the vast, unforgiving prairie, then back at the broken woman on the wagon. "You've got the road ahead of you," he said firmly. "And for today, you've got me. I'm not leaving you out here, Josephine Bennett, not today and not until you're somewhere safe." He didn't ask for her permission. He simply began to unhitch his canteen, and Josephine, for the first time since the world ended, felt the faint, terrifying flutter of hope. The Thompson Ranch was an oasis of sun-bleached adobe and weathered timber nestled in a valley where a rare, year-round creek cut a silver ribbon through the dust. To Josephine, arriving there felt less like a homecoming and more like a surrender. She was a woman who had been hollowed out by the wind, and the solid weight of the ranch's main house seemed the only thing keeping her from drifting away entirely. Margaret Thompson was a woman carved from the same hard earth as the hills, but her eyes held a softness that Thomas's family back in Missouri had never possessed. She didn't offer Josephine pity. Pity was a cheap currency on the frontier. Instead, she offered a heavy ceramic bowl of beef stew and a task. "Grief is a ghost that hates a busy hand," Margaret told her on the third morning, her voice rasping slightly from the heart condition that made her breath short. "If you're going to stay under this roof, Josephine, you'll work until your bones ache. It's the only way to sleep without seeing the dead." And work Josephine did. She rose before the sun had even thought of touching the horizon, the air in her small lean-to room sharp and cold. She hauled water until her shoulders burned. She kneaded bread dough until her forearms felt like lead. She scrubbed the grit of the Mojave from the floorboards until her fingernails were ragged. Harrison was a constant, quiet shadow in the periphery of her new life. He didn't hover, but he was always there. When a shutter banged in the night, it was Harrison who appeared with a hammer before she could even find a candle. When she struggled with a heavy crate of potatoes, his calloused hands would suddenly appear, taking the weight without a word. "You don't have to do that," she told him one evening as the sun dipped low, turning the scrub brush into silhouettes of gold. He was at the porch, sharpening his pocket knife on a whetstone. "Maybe not," Harrison replied, his blue-green eyes catching the fading light. "But a man doesn't watch a lady break her back when he's got 2 good arms. How's the mare?" "Better. Margaret says she's got a few miles left in her." Josephine looked at her hands, mourning the softness they'd once had. I feel like I'm just waiting for the next storm to blow me over, Harrison. Why did you really stop that day? Harrison stopped the rhythmic shick-shick of the blade. He looked out toward the bunkhouse, his jaw tight. I know what it's like to look at the horizon and see nothing but an end. After the fire, after my folks were gone, I sat in the dirt for 3 days. No one stopped. I swore if I ever saw that look on another soul, I wouldn't just ride by. A connection, thin as a spider's silk, but strong as iron, pulled between them. Josephine felt a heat in her chest that wasn't the desert sun, but the storm she feared didn't come from the sky. It came from within. The change started as a dull malaise. She blamed the heat, the grease of the bacon, the exhaustion of the chores. But then came the morning she was over the washboard, scrubbing the ranch hand's heavy denim, and the world suddenly tilted. The smell of the lye soap, usually sharp and clean, turned her stomach into a knot of iron. She barely made it to the edge of the porch before she collapsed, her vision narrowing to a pinprick of white. "Josephine!" She felt Harrison's arms before she heard his voice. He caught her before her head hit the boards, his strength a terrifyingly steady anchor. "Margaret, get water," he bellowed. When Josephine came to, she was in the shade of the kitchen, Margaret hovering over her with a damp cloth. Harrison was standing in the doorway, his Stetson crushed in his hands, his face a mask of raw worry. "It's the heat," Josephine whispered, trying to sit up. I forgot to drink." Margaret didn't look convinced. She pressed a hand to Josephine's forehead, then slid it down to her wrist, counting the pulse. The older woman's eyes went sharp, narrowed with a wisdom that had seen births and burials in equal measure. "Harrison, go check the south fence," Margaret said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "But she—" "Go, now." Once the screen door slammed behind him, Margaret sat heavily on the bench beside Josephine. "How long has it been, dear, since your monthly flow stopped?" Josephine froze. The world went silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She did the math in her head, the numbers falling like stones into a well. "Thomas died 2 weeks ago. We were on the trail for 4 before that." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a go-a-foo. She was a vessel. "I'm with child," Josephine breathed, her hand instinctively flying to her still flat stomach. "A blessing and a burden," Margaret whispered, taking her hand. "But you're not alone, Josephine, do you hear me? This ranch protects its own." Josephine looked toward the window where Harrison was visible in the distance, mounting his buckskin. She felt a surge of terror. How could she tell him? How could she tell this man who looked at her with such growing tenderness that she carried the ghost of the man she had buried in the sand? The grief was no longer her only companion. Now, there was a heartbeat. The ride to Randsburg took a full day, a journey through a landscape of jagged rock and stunted Joshua trees that looked like distorted men frozen in prayer. Harrison insisted on driving the wagon himself, with Josephine seated beside him. He claimed it was because the trail was unpredictable, but Josephine knew it was because he had noticed her paleness, her sudden aversion to the smell of the campfire coffee. "We get the papers from the land office. We buy the supplies Margaret needs and we leave," Harrison said, his grip tight on the reins. "Randsburg isn't a place for a woman. It's a place where men go to forget they have souls." "I have to know, Harrison," Josephine said, her voice steady despite the nausea rolling in her gut. "Thomas spent everything on that 40-acre plot. He said it was the promised land. If the papers aren't right, I have nothing to give my future." She still hadn't told him about the baby. Every time she tried, the words died in her throat. Randsburg was a scar on the earth. It was a chaotic jumble of canvas tents, rough-hewn saloons, and the skeletal remains of mining derricks. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and desperation. As their wagon rolled down the main street, men with hollow eyes and dirt-streaked faces stopped to stare. A woman as young and striking as Josephine was a rare sight, and the hunger in their eyes made her pull her shawl tighter. Harrison didn't miss a single glance. His hand rested habitually on the butt of his peacemaker, and the sheer lethality of his posture kept the vultures at bay. The land office was a cramped, sweltering room that smelled of old ledger ink and stale cigars. Behind a high desk sat a man with spectacles so thick his eyes looked like pale grapes. "Bennett?" the clerk muttered, flipping through a dusty book. "40 acres near the northern spring? Oh, I remember that one. Poor fool bought it sight unseen." "I'm his widow," Josephine said, leaning over the counter. "I'm here to claim the deed." The clerk looked at her, a flash of genuine pity crossing his face. "The deed is yours, ma'am, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you. That land's a boneyard. No water, no grass, just salt and rock." "That's not possible," Josephine whispered. Thomas saw the advertisement. It said, "Fertile soil, ample water." "Advertisements are written by liars, ma'am," a new voice drawled from the doorway. Josephine and Harrison turned. Standing in the entrance was a man who looked like he had never spent a day under the sun. He wore a suit of charcoal silk, a gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat, and boots that shone like polished obsidian. His smile didn't reach his eyes that were as cold and gray as a winter sea. "Silas Thorne," Harrison hissed, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "Harrison Trent," the man replied, tilting his head. "I heard you were still playing nursemaid at the Thompson place. A waste of talent." Thorne turned his predatory gaze to Josephine. He stepped closer, the smell of expensive bay rum clashing with the filth of the town. "Mrs. Bennett, I presume. I knew your husband, briefly." "You knew Thomas?" Josephine asked, her heart racing. "I'm the one who sold him that land," Thorne said, his voice as smooth as oil. "And I'm a fair man. I told him it was a bad investment. I told him he was throwing away his life savings on a dust bowl, but he was desperate. He had debts back in Missouri, didn't he? Men coming for his blood? He needed a place to disappear, and he didn't care if nothing grew there as long as it was far away." The world seemed to crumble beneath Josephine's feet. Thomas had lied? The dreams of gardens and green meadows. Were they all just a cover for a man running from his own shadow? "He wouldn't," Josephine whispered. "He loved me." "He loved his skin more," Thorne countered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin, tossing it into the air and catching it. "The land is worthless, Mrs. Bennett, but I'm a charitable man. I'll buy it back from you for $50. Enough to get you a stagecoach ticket back east, where a girl like you belongs." Harrison stepped between them, his chest inches from Thorne's. "She's not selling, and she's not going anywhere." "Is that so?" Thorne smiled, a thin, dangerous line. "The Thompson Ranch is struggling, Harrison. Robert's heart is failing, the cattle are thinning. How long do you think you can protect her? In this country, the weak are buried and the strong. Well, we own the dirt they're buried in." "Get out," Harrison growled. Thorne chuckled, tipped his hat to Josephine, and stepped out into the dusty street. Josephine slumped against the counter, the weight of the revelation crushing the breath from her lungs. Her husband hadn't been a pioneer. He had been a fugitive. And Harrison. Harrison had been risking his life for a woman whose entire future was a lie. "We're leaving," Harrison said, his voice a low vibration of anger. He took the deed from the stunned clerk and grabbed Josephine's arm. As they walked back to the wagon, Josephine felt a sharp cramp in her abdomen, a reminder of the secret she was still carrying. She looked at Harrison's profile, the rugged jaw set in a line of iron. "Harrison," she choked out. "What if he's right? What if there's nothing there?" Harrison stopped and turned to her. He took both of her hands in his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. It doesn't matter what Thomas did, Josephine. And it doesn't matter what Thorne says. You've got the land. And as long as I'm standing, you've got me. We'll find a way to make it bloom, or we'll die trying. Josephine looked into his blue-green eyes and realized with a terrifying jolt that she was falling in love with him. And that love was the most dangerous thing of all, for she was still bound to a dead man's debt and a villain's vendetta. The desert night was not silent. To those who didn't know it, the darkness seemed like a void. But to Josephine, sitting by the crackling embers of a small sagebrush fire, it was a cacophony of whispers. There was the dry scuttle of a scorpion over stone, the distant mournful yip of a coyote, and the restless shifting of the horses tethered nearby. They were halfway between Ransburg and the Thompson Ranch, camping in a shallow draw that offered a meager shield against the wind. The confrontation with Silas Thorne hung over them like a toxic cloud. Josephine huddled in her shawl, her hand resting flat against her stomach. The secret inside her, the child, felt heavier than the grief she had carried across the prairie. It was a living anchor, tethering her to a future she no longer understood. Harrison sat across the fire, his silhouette sharp and jagged against the dancing flames. He was cleaning his peacemaker, the rhythmic snick-click of the metal pieces providing a mechanical heartbeat to the night. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they left the land office. "Harrison," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the wind. "Is it true? About the land?" He didn't look up. "Thorne is a snake, Josephine. He feeds on doubt. He wants you to believe it's worthless, so you'll hand it over for pennies. Land is only dead if a man is too lazy to work it." "But what if Thomas knew?" she pressed, the bitterness of betrayal stinging her tongue. "What if he brought me all this way knowing we were heading toward a graveyard? He told me there were meadows. He told me the soil was black and rich like Missouri. Silas said he was running from debts, from men who wanted his blood." Harrison finally looked up. The firelight turned his blue-green eyes into flickering emeralds. "Most men out here are running from something, Josephine, myself included. Thomas isn't here to answer for his choices, but you are. You're the one who has to decide if his lie matters more than the land beneath your feet." "I don't even know who he was anymore," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Harrison set the pistol aside and moved closer, crouching by the fire. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, sending a spray of sparks upward toward the indifferent stars. "We all have ghosts, Josephine. Some of us just carry them in our pockets, while others let them drive the wagon." "Tell me about yours," she said suddenly. "You mentioned a fire. You said you sat in the dirt for 3 days." Harrison went still. The air seemed to grow colder, the warmth of the fire retreating. He stared into the coals for a long time, his jaw working as if he were grinding stones. "It was Texas," he began, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rough rasp. "5 years ago. My pa had a small spread, nothing fancy, just a few hundred head, and a house my ma had filled with lace curtains and the smell of cinnamon. We weren't rich, but we were ours. We had a neighbor, a man who wanted the water rights to our creek. He offered Pa a pittance. Pa told him to go to hell." Josephine watched him, her breath held. The way Harrison's hands tightened on the stick told her more than his words. "One night the wind was howling off the plains," Harrison continued. "Dry as a bone. I was in the barn tending to a sick foal. I smelled it before I saw it, the sharp, oily scent of kerosene. By the time I got outside, the porch was a wall of orange. It moved like a living thing, screaming as it ate the wood." He closed his eyes, his face contorting in the firelight. "I tried to get to the door. The heat. It peeled the skin back on my arms. I could hear Ma screaming. I could hear Pa shouting for her. Then the roof groaned, that terrible heavy sound of a heart breaking, and the whole thing just collapsed. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes for 19 years of my life to turn into ash." Josephine moved toward him, her heart aching. "Oh, Harrison, I'm so sorry." I stayed there, he said, his voice hollow. I sat in the black soot until the embers stopped glowing. I didn't have a shovel, so I used my hands to dig them out. I buried them under the big oak they used to sit under on Sunday afternoons. When I was done, I had nothing. No house, no cattle, no family. Just a name I'd heard whispered in the wind before the match was struck. Whose name? Josephine asked, her voice a mere breath. A man who worked for the syndicate, Harrison said. A land specialist, they called him. A man who cleaned up the titles for the big cattle kings. He fell silent again, the memory of the fire seemingly burning behind his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred object, a silver locket, blackened and fused shut. This was the only thing I found. Ma's locket. Josephine reached out, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. The touch was electric, a grounding wire in the storm of his memory. Harrison didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. For a moment, they weren't a widow and a cowboy. They were just two broken things trying to hold each other together. What did Silas Thorne call himself today? Harrison asked suddenly, his voice sharp and focused. A charitable man? Josephine offered. No, Harrison shook his head. He said he was the one who sold Thomas the land. He said he cleaned up the debts. Harrison stood up abruptly, his eyes wide as if seeing something invisible in the dark. He walked over to where his saddlebags lay and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the deed to Josephine's land that they had collected at the office. Let me see that locket, Josephine said, sensing the shift in him. He handed it to her. She turned the blackened silver over in her palm. It was fused, but on the back, where the heat had been less intense, there was a faint engraving, a stylized S entwined with a T. I thought it stood for Sarah Trent, my ma, Harrison whispered. But look at the seal on that deed, Josephine. Josephine held the paper near the fire. In the bottom corner, embossed in the heavy vellum, was a seal for the Randsburg Land and Development Company. It featured a stylized S entwined with a T. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas Thorne, Harrison breathed, the name coming out like a curse. He wasn't just a neighbor's henchman, he was the syndicate. He moved from Texas to California, changing his coat, but not his heart. He's been doing this for years, burning people out, selling them dead land, then buying it back when they're desperate enough to crawl. Hit Josephine like a physical weight. Harrison hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been on a collision course with the man who had destroyed his life, and she was the bait Silas had used to lure her husband to his death. He killed them, Harrison whispered, his hand going to his pistol. The raw, unadulterated rage in his voice made Josephine shiver. He set the fire. He watched it burn. And now he's trying to do the same to you. Harrison, look at me, Josephine cried, standing up and grabbing his arms. If you go back there now, he'll kill you. He has the law in his pocket and a dozen men in his employ. You're one man. I'm a man who's been waiting 5 years to finish a grave, Harrison roared, his eyes wild. And I'm a woman who has nothing but you, Josephine shouted back. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a truth neither of them was ready to admit. Harrison froze, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on hers. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. You have the land, he said, his voice cracking. The land is just dirt, she said, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from him. You're the one who refused to leave my side. You're the one who gave me a reason to eat, to sleep, to breathe. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't keep it in anymore. The weight of the secret was tearing her apart. Harrison, I'm not just fighting for a 40-acre plot, she whispered, taking his hand and pressing it against her belly. I'm fighting for him. Or her. Thomas's child. The shock that crossed Harrison's face was total. His hand, so large and scarred, felt impossibly heavy against the softness of her dress. He looked down at her stomach, then back at her eyes, his expression a chaotic mix of awe, pain, and a protective instinct so fierce it was almost tangible. "A baby?" he breathed. "I found out a few days ago," she said, tears finally spilling over. "I was so scared, I thought you'd leave. Why would a man like you want to burden himself with a widow and another man's child, especially if that man was a liar?" Harrison didn't speak. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, wrapping her in a grip so tight it felt like he was trying to shield her from the entire world. He buried his face in her hair, his breath warm against her neck. "I don't care whose blood the child has, Josephine," he whispered fiercely. "It's yours, and you're everything I have left in this world. I'm not leaving. I'm never leaving." They stood there for a long time, held together by the flickering light of the fire and the shared weight of their tragedies. Harrison's rage hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer a fire that wanted to burn. It was a fire that wanted to protect. "We aren't going to sell," Harrison said, his voice now cold and precise. "We're going to that 40 acres. We're going to find that water Thomas dreamed about. And if Silas Thorne wants this land, he's going to have to come through me to get it." Josephine leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but for the first time it was balanced by a fierce, defiant hope. Silas Thorne had the money and the power, but they had the truth, and they had each other. "The curse of fire," Josephine whispered, looking at the charred locket in her hand. "He used it to destroy your past, Harrison. But we're going to use it to forge our future." Harrison took the locket from her and tucked it back into his pocket. He looked out into the darkness, toward Randsburg, and then toward the north where their land lay. "Let him come," Harrison said, his hand resting on Josephine's waist, shielding the life growing inside her. "The desert is a big place. Plenty of room for more graves." As the fire died down to glowing embers, they lay down side by side, their fingers intertwined. The prairie was still harsh, the journey ahead was still long, and a monster was watching them from the shadows. But as Josephine drifted into a restless sleep, she felt the steady, unwavering heartbeat of the man beside her, and she knew that no matter what happened, she would never have to cross the prairie alone again. The wind didn't just blow across the Mojave, it searched. It clawed at the canvas of the wagon, pried at the buttons of Josephine's coat, and carried the fine alkaline dust into every pore and promise. It was a relentless, invisible adversary, a reminder that the land they were trying to claim didn't want them. They stood in the yard of the Thompson Ranch at dawn, the sky a bruised purple bleeding into a pale, sickly yellow. The departure felt like leaving the only sanctuary left in a world gone mad. Margaret stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her face etched with a worry that she couldn't hide behind her usual stoic mask. "You don't have to do this, Josephine," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a room for you here. There's a place for the babe when it comes. You're heading into the mouth of a lion with nothing but a dream and a cowboy who's looking for a fight." Josephine climbed onto the wagon seat, her movements slower now, more deliberate. She looked at Margaret, then at Robert, who stood by the hitching post, his hand resting on the hilt of his heavy cane. "I've spent my whole life being told where I belong," Josephine said softly. "By my father, by his wife, even by Thomas. For the first time, I'm heading towards something I chose. Even if it's just dirt and rock, it's my dirt." Robert stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Harrison. "A man with a vendetta is a man with a blindfold, Harrison. Silas Thorne isn't just a man, he's a machine. He's got the sheriff in Randsburg on his payroll, and more guns than you've got fingers. You're taking this girl into a slaughterhouse." Harrison adjusted his hat, his face a mask of granite. He didn't look at Robert. He was checking the cinch on his buckskin, his movements sharp and efficient. I'm not taking her anywhere she doesn't want to go, Robert. And I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking to end one." Robert sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key and a folded map. "There's a cabin about 20 miles north near the Devil's Throat. It belonged to a prospector who died 10 years back. It's sturdy, and there's a spring that rarely goes dry. If the wind gets too high, or if you see dust on the horizon that isn't the wind's doing, you hide there." Harrison took the key, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "Thank you, Robert, for everything." "Don't thank me," Robert grunted. "Just bring her back if the land won't have you." As the wagon rolled out of the yard, Josephine looked back until the ranch buildings were nothing but specks against the vast golden bowl of the valley. Beside her, Harrison rode in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a soldier in a war he had been fighting since he was 19. The trail north was harder than the trail from Missouri. The path was narrow, choked with boulders and skeletal Joshua trees that seemed to point accusing fingers at them. The heat was a physical weight, but it was the wind that wore them down. It shrieked through the canyons, a high, lonesome sound that made the horses skittish and kept Josephine's nerves raw. By midday, the nausea returned to Josephine with a vengeance. She leaned over the side of the wagon, her stomach cramping, her head spinning. Harrison was off his horse in an instant, his hand steadying her shoulder. "Easy, Josephine. Easy," he whispered. He helped her down and sat her in the small patch of shade cast by a large rock. He brought her water, filtered through a clean rag, and made her chew on a piece of dried apple. "We can turn back," he said, his voice tight with a conflict she knew was tearing him apart. "Robert was right. This isn't a place for a woman in your condition." Josephine wiped her mouth, her jaw set. "My condition isn't a sickness, Harrison. It's a reason. Every mile we put between us and that ranch is a mile closer to a home for this child. I won't go back to being a guest. I won't go back to being a charity case." Harrison looked at her, and for a moment the hardness in his eyes vanished, replaced by an admiration so deep it made Josephine's breath catch. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray hair from her forehead. "You're the strongest thing I've ever known," he said. They pushed on. The landscape grew more jagged, the red rocks of the Devil's Throat rising up like the teeth of some prehistoric beast. The trail here was a narrow ledge between a steep cliff and a deep, shadow-filled gorge. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Harrison felt it before he saw it. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He nudged his buckskin closer to the wagon. "Josephine," he whispered, his hand hovering over his holster. "Get down. Into the bed of the wagon. Now." "What is it?" she asked, her heart leaping into her throat. "Don't argue. Just get down." Josephine scrambled over the seat, huddled behind her trunk and the water barrel. She reached for the Winchester, her fingers trembling. The memory of the shot she had fired flashed through her mind, the kick of the rifle, the smell of the smoke. She hadn't wanted to kill then. She didn't know if she could now. The first shot didn't come from a rifle. "No le ting-dong kumat honda lanlo trenvatnui." "There!" Harrison roared. He drew his peacemaker in a blur of motion, firing toward a cluster of boulders 50 yards up the slope. A man in a dark duster tumbled out from behind the rocks, his rifle clattering against the stones. But there were more. A hail of bullets struck the wagon, splintering the wood, ripping through the canvas. The mare screamed in terror, rearing up in the traces. "Hiya!" Harrison shouted, slapping the horse's flank to keep the wagon moving. "Keep your head down, Josephine." Harrison rode like a demon, leaning low over the buckskin's neck, his pistol barking rhythmically. He was a target, drawing the fire away from the wagon, moving with a reckless grace that made Josephine's heart stop. She saw a flash of metal from a ridge to their right. A man was aiming a long-range Sharps rifle. "Harrison, to your right!" she screamed. Harrison turned, but he was a second too late. The heavy thwack of a high-caliber bullet hitting flesh echoed through the canyon. Josephine watched in horror as Harrison was nearly blown off his horse. His right arm, his shooting arm, jerked violently. His peacemaker flew from his hand, spinning into the abyss of the gorge. He slumped forward, his face hitting the buckskin's mane, his hand clutching a shoulder that was suddenly terrifyingly red. "Harrison!" The wagon was still rolling. The mare panicked and out of control. Harrison's horse was veering toward the edge of the cliff. Josephine didn't think. She couldn't afford to. She surged up from the wagon bed, grabbing the reins of the mare with one hand and hauling her back, screaming for the animal to stop. The wagon lurched to a halt, skidding dangerously close to the drop-off. The shooters were closing in, thinking the threat was neutralized. 3 men emerged from the rocks, grinning with the cruel certainty of predators. Josephine grabbed the Winchester. She climbed back onto the seat, her legs shaking, her vision blurred by tears of rage. She saw Harrison hanging onto his horse by pure instinct, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the white dust of the trail. "Stay away from him!" she shrieked. The lead gunman, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, laughed. "Look at that, boys. The little widow wants to play." He raised his rifle. Josephine didn't hesitate this time. She pulled the stock of the Winchester into the hollow of her shoulder, just as Thomas had taught her, just as she had done when she first met Harrison. She breathed out, the world narrowing to the silver bead at the end of the barrel. Crack! The scarred man's hat flew off his head. The bullet grazed his scalp, sending him spinning to the ground in a panic. Crack! Crack! She fired again and again, not aiming to kill, but with a terrifying, wild accuracy that forced the other 2 men back into the shadows. They hadn't expected the prey to have teeth. They hadn't expected a woman with nothing but grief to have a trigger finger made of iron. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I'll kill every one of you!" The men, realizing the nursemaid was gone and a lioness had taken her place, retreated into the rocks. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. They weren't paid enough to die at the hands of a pregnant Goa Fu. The silence returned, heavier than before. Josephine dropped the rifle and leaped from the wagon. She ran to Harrison, who had finally slid from his horse and was slumped against a rock, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. "Harrison," she sobbed, kneeling beside him. His right arm was a mess. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his forearm and shattered the bone near the elbow. Blood was pumping out, hot and bright. "Josephine," he wheezed, his face gray, sweat pouring down his forehead. You have to go. Take the buckskin. Leave the wagon. Get to the cabin." "Be quiet," she commanded, her voice cracking but firm. "I'm not leaving you. I told you that." She ripped a long strip of fabric from her petticoat. She remembered Margaret's lessons, the way she had tended to the ranch hand's injuries. She tied a tourniquet above his elbow, twisting it with a stick until the flow of blood slowed. Harrison groaned, his head falling back against the rock, his eyes rolling. She whispered to herself, though she didn't know why. The world had shifted. The man who refused to leave her side was now the man who couldn't stand on his own. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hauled him up. He was a dead weight, a mountain of muscle and leather. But she didn't let him fall. She guided him to the wagon, helping him heave his body into the back. "Stay with me, Harrison," she pleaded. "Stay with me." She climbed back onto the seat. She looked at the blood on her hands, the red stains on her calico dress. She looked at the trail ahead, the devil's throat narrowing into a dark, uncertain future. She picked up the reins. She didn't look back. "Hiya!" she shouted, and the wagon began to move. The wind rose again, howling through the rocks, but Josephine Bennett didn't flinch. She had crossed the prairie with nothing but grief, but she was leaving the canyon with a purpose. She was no longer the passenger. She was the driver. And she was going to bring her cowboy home. The sun was a jagged blade, cutting through the haze of dust and the metallic scent of blood that clung to the inside of the wagon. Josephine drove until her eyes felt like they had been seared by the very light she sought to escape. She drove until the reins were fused to her palms, her body acting on a primitive instinct that bypassed thought and went straight to survival. Behind her, in the bed of the wagon, Harrison's groans had thinned into a dry, rhythmic wheeze that terrified her more than any shout could. She had bypassed the prospector's cabin Robert mentioned, driven by a frantic, irrational need to reach the boundary markers of her own land. She needed to know if she had saved him for a graveyard or a home. When the wagon finally lurched to a halt, the silence that rushed in was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a forest or the expectant silence of a library. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a land that had forgotten how to breathe. Josephine climbed down, her legs buckling as her boots hit the alkali crust. She stood at the edge of the 40 acres Thomas had bought. It was a wasteland. Before her lay a flat expanse of cracked earth, bleached white by salt and time. Stunted greasewood and skeletal mesquite fought for space among jagged volcanic rocks that looked like the teeth of a buried demon. There was no meadow, there was no creek, only the shimmering heat and the mocking cry of a single crow circling above. "Thomas," she whispered, the name a bitter ash in her mouth, "what have you done to us?" But there was no time for despair. A low, ragged cough from the wagon snapped her back to the present. Harrison was dying. She hauled herself back into the wagon. Harrison was a ghost of the man he had been 48 hours ago. His face was the color of wet clay, his eyes sunken and rimmed with a feverish red. The makeshift tourniquet was soaked through, a dark, ominous stain that had spread across the floorboards. "Water," he croaked, his lips cracked and bleeding. Josephine moved with a frantic efficiency. She used the last of the clean water to wash the grime from his face, then forced a few drops between his teeth. She had to get him out of the heat. Near the center of the plot, tucked into the lee of a granite ridge, she saw the remains of a dugout, a primitive shelter half buried in the earth, likely left by a previous settler who had lacked the heart to stay. It took her 3 hours to move him. She used the wagon's canvas as a sled, dragging his dead weight across the salt flats, her breath coming in jagged sobs. Each inch felt like a mile, her muscles screaming, her pregnancy-weakened body protesting with every tug. By the time she got him inside the cool, dim confines of the dugout, she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. The dugout was small, smelling of dry rot and old earth, but it was cool. She laid him on a bed of dry grass and began the grim work of tending to his arm. She had to remove the lead. The bullet was lodged deep in the muscle of his forearm near the shattered radius. She had no whiskey to dull his pain, only a small bottle of laudanum she had saved from her own supplies. "Harrison, I have to," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held a knife over the small fire she had managed to scrape together from dried brush. He gripped her wrist with his left hand, his strength surprising even in his delirium. His eyes flickered open, bright with agony. "Do it," he hissed. Don't let me lose the arm, Joe. A cowboy without an arm is a man without a life." The next hour was a blur of gore and terror. Josephine dug into the meat of the man she loved, her stomach churning, her heart hammering against her ribs. Harrison screamed once, a sound that would haunt her dreams for decades, and then plummeted into a merciful unconsciousness. When the lead finally clinked against the bottom of a tin cup, Josephine collapsed beside him, her dress soaked in blood and sweat. She stayed by his side through the night, watching his chest rise and fall, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She bathed his brow with the last of the water, knowing that if she didn't find a source soon, the desert would finish what the bullets had started. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the dugout's timber roof, Josephine found herself spiraling into a dark, hollow place. She looked at Harrison, scarred, broken, and feverish, and then out at the barren salt flats. She felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred for Thomas Bennett. He had led her here to die. He had led Harrison here to die. Seeking comfort, seeking anything that felt like a connection to the life she had lost, she reached for her sewing kit, the one thing she had refused to sell. Inside was the heavy pouch of seeds Thomas had guarded so fiercely. "Why?" she whispered, clutching the pouch to her chest. Why keep these seeds for a land of salt? She began to empty the bag, looking for a needle to mend Harrison's shirt. But as the handful of dried corn and squash seeds spilled into her lap, she felt something hard and flat at the bottom of the bag. It was a piece of oilcloth folded tightly. Her fingers shook as she unwrapped it. Inside was a letter, written in Thomas's cramped, labored handwriting, dated only weeks before he had died. My dearest Josephine, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I have left you alone on a trail I should never have asked you to walk. I know what Silas Thorne told you in Randsburg, or what he will tell you. He will say I was a fool, a debtor, a man who bought a boneyard. He is right about the debts, Joe. I ran from Missouri because I owed men who had no mercy. But he is wrong about the land. Thorne sold me this plot because he thought it was dead. He thought he was cheating a desperate man. But he didn't know I worked as a surveyor's apprentice when I was a boy. I saw the geological charts Thorne's own men ignored. This land is sitting on a volcanic shelf. The rocks you see, they aren't just stones. They are a cap. There is a spring beneath the granite ridge, Joe. A sleeping water. It's blocked by a slide from 100 years ago. If you look at the base of the ridge, where the black rock meets the red sand, you'll see a line of green scrub that shouldn't be there. That's the breath of the water. Dig there. Don't let Thorne take it from you. It's not just land, Joe. It's the life I couldn't give you. It's the future for the child I know is coming. Forgive me for the lies. I only wanted to be the man you thought I was. You're Thomas. Josephine stared at the paper until the words blurred. Hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Thomas hadn't been a villain. He had been a man trying to outrun his past by gambling on a miracle. He hadn't bought a graveyard, he had bought a hidden fortress. She stood up, the letter clutched in her hand, and walked out of the dugout. The sun was rising, turning the salt flats into a sheet of hammered gold. She looked at the granite ridge, and there, just as Thomas had described, was a thin, defiant line of green creosote and wild tobacco huddled at the base of the black rock. It was a sign. Harrison, she whispered, turning back toward the dugout. Harrison, wake up. We aren't dead yet. She spent the next several hours in a frenzy of activity. She found a rusted pickaxe in the corner of the dugout and began to hack at the base of the ridge. Each strike sent a shockwave through her arms, through her aching back, but she didn't stop. She dug until the sun was at its zenith, until her hands were bleeding, until she hit something that wasn't sand or stone. Mud. Cool, damp, dark mud. She dropped the pickaxe and fell to her knees, clawing at the earth with her bare hands. A trickle of water, no thicker than a finger, began to seep from the crack in the rock. It was clear, cold, and tasted like life itself. Water, she sobbed, splashing it onto her face. Water! She filled a canteen and ran back to the dugout. Harrison was awake, though his eyes were still clouded with pain. She held the canteen to his lips, and he drank with a desperation that brought tears to her eyes. Where did you find it? He whispered, his voice a ghost of its former self. Thomas found it, she said, leaning her forehead against his. He didn't lie about everything, Harrison. He left us a chance. Harrison looked at the letter she had placed on his chest. He reached out with his left hand, his fingers brushing over the oilcloth. A slow, pained smile touched his lips. Surveyor's apprentice. I'll be damned. But the victory was short-lived. As Josephine looked out the door of the dugout, she saw a thin plume of dust rising from the south. It wasn't the wind. It was a group of riders. Silas Thorne's men were coming to see if the desert had finished the job. Josephine looked at Harrison's shattered arm, then at the Winchester leaning against the wall. She looked at the small trickle of water that was slowly turning the dust into life. They're coming, aren't ho? Harrison asked, his voice hardening, the soldier returning to his eyes. Yes, Josephine said, picking up the rifle and checking the magazine. "But they're coming to my land, and I've got 40 acres of reasons to stop them." Harrison tried to sit up, but the movement made him gasp. Josephine pushed him back down gently. "Rest, Harrison. You rode beside me through the darkness. Now it's my turn to stand watch." She stepped out into the blinding light, the Winchester heavy in her hands. The silence of the land was gone, replaced by the rhythmic thud of approaching hooves. Josephine Bennett, the woman who had arrived with nothing but grief, stood at the edge of the sleeping water and waited. She was no longer a victim of the prairie. She was its guardian, and she was ready to fight for every drop of the future they had found. The water didn't just flow, it sang. It was a low, bubbling gurgle that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Josephine's boots. In the 2 hours since she had breached the granite shelf, the trickle had become a steady stream, carving a dark, wet vein through the thirsty white alkali. To anyone else, it was just a spring. To Josephine, it was the sound of a heartbeat returning to a corpse. But the melody of the water was soon drowned out by the rhythmic drumming of hooves. "Joe," Harrison's voice was a sandpaper rasp from inside the dugout. He had managed to prop himself up against the earth wall, his face beaded with the cold sweat of a fever, his left hand clutching the Colt he had salvaged from his holster. "They're here." Josephine stepped out of the shadow of the ridge, the Winchester's stock tucked firmly under her arm. The dust cloud to the south had materialized into 4 riders. At the center, riding a sleek coal-black stallion that looked offensively elegant against the ragged desert, was Silas Thorne. He didn't look like a man coming for a fight. He looked like a man coming to inspect a purchase. He wore a crisp linen duster and a silver-gray Stetson, his gloved hands holding the reins with a casual, predatory ease. The riders drew rein 20 yards from the dugout. The scarred man from the canyon, his head now wrapped in a bloody bandage, glared at Josephine with a hatred so pure it made the air feel cold. "Mrs. Bennett," Silas called out, his voice smooth and carrying. "I see the desert hasn't been kind to your wardrobe, but it seems to have sparked a certain fire in your spirit. I hear you're a formidable shot." "One step closer, Silas, and I'll show you exactly how formidable," Josephine replied. Her voice didn't shake. The weight of the child in her womb felt like a shield, giving her a center of gravity she had never known. Silas chuckled, a dry sound like parchment rubbing together. He dismounted, ignoring the rifle pointed at his chest. He walked toward the edge of the dark, wet mud where the spring was beginning to pool. He knelt, dipping a gloved finger into the water, then brought it to his lips. "Sleeping water," he whispered, a look of genuine dark admiration crossing his face. "That fool Thomas actually found it. I searched this sector for 3 years and found nothing but salt, and here it is bubbling up for a widow and a broken-down cowpoke." "It's not yours, Silas," Josephine said. "This is Bennett land. The deed is recorded." "Ah, the deed." Silas stood up, wiping his hand on his duster. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored document embossed with the official seal of the territory. "You see, Mrs. Bennett, there's been a slight administrative correction. It seems your husband's purchase was predicated on a fraudulent survey. The territory has reclaimed the title, and as of yesterday, the Randsburg Land and Development Company has legally acquired the rights to this entire valley." Hit the air like a lightning strike. Silas held the paper aloft, the gold leaf of the seal catching the sun. It was a fake. It had to be. But in a land where the law was written by the man with the most ink and the most lead, a fake deed was as good as a divine decree. "You're a liar!" A new voice joined the standoff. Harrison emerged from the dugout, leaning heavily against the timber frame. He was pale as a ghost, his right arm bound in blood-stained rags and tucked into a makeshift sling. Despite his weakness, the aura of violence surrounding him was so potent that Silas's men instinctively shifted their hands toward their holsters. "Trent," Silas sneered, "I'm surprised you're still breathing." You always did have a stubborn streak. It's what made your father so difficult to persuade. You murdered my family for a creek in Texas, Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. And now you're here for a spring in California. You're a locust, Silas. You strip everything green until there's nothing left but bone. I am progress, Silas countered, his eyes snapping to the water. This water will run a rail line through these hills. It will build a city. Do you really think a judge is going to let it stay in the hands of a woman and a cripple? Silas stepped forward, his expression hardening. I'll give you one last chance, Mrs. Bennett. $50. Sign the quitclaim, and I'll let you take the wagon and leave. If not, well, the desert is very good at hiding things that are no longer useful. Josephine looked at Harrison. He gave her a singular, sharp nod. She turned back to Silas, her finger tightening on the Winchester's trigger. I've buried one man in this desert, Mr. Thorne. I don't mind burying 4 more. Get off my land. Silas's face contorted into a mask of cold fury. He stepped back toward his horse. So be it. My men will be back at sundown. The law won't be with them, Mrs. Bennett. Only the lead. As the riders turned and galloped back toward Randsburg, Josephine felt the adrenaline drain out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. They had found the water, but they had also painted a target on their backs that could be seen from miles away. Night fell over the sleeping water like a velvet shroud, but there was no peace in the darkness. Josephine had spent the afternoon fortifying the dugout. She had moved the wagon to block the main entrance, creating a funnel that would force any attackers into the line of fire. Harrison sat on a crate, his left hand tirelessly cleaning the Winchester, his right arm a useless, aching weight at his side. You should sleep, Joe, Harrison said, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon was beginning to rise. I'll take the first watch. We'll take it together, she said, sitting beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the smell of wood smoke and dried blood oddly comforting. Do you think they'll really come back? Thorne can't let this go, Harrison whispered. This water is worth $100,000 to the railroad. To a man like him, we're just weeds in the garden. Before Josephine could respond, the silence of the night was shattered. But it wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was the frantic, uneven rattle of a light buckboard wagon, the horse being pushed to the brink of collapse. The sound was coming from the east, the opposite direction of Randsburg. Harrison was on his feet in an instant, his left hand steadying the rifle against the wagon wheel. Get back, Josephine! A lone wagon burst through the sagebrush, the mule in the traces foaming at the mouth. The driver was a woman, her hair a wild tangle of dark curls, her dress torn and covered in the gray dust of a long, desperate flight. She saw the dugout and hauled on the reins, the wagon skidding to a halt just feet from Josephine. The woman collapsed off the seat, her legs giving out as she hit the sand. She was clutching a leather-bound satchel to her chest, as if it were a child. "Help!" she wheezed, her voice a broken sob. "Please!" "He's coming!" Josephine rushed forward, ignoring Harrison's warning. She knelt beside the woman, turning her face to the moonlight. The woman was beautiful, but her face was a map of bruises. A darkened eye, a split lip, and a jagged scar along her jawline that looked old and poorly healed. Harrison moved closer, the rifle lowering as he stared at the woman's face. He froze. The color drained from his already pale skin, and the Winchester slipped from his fingers, clattering into the dirt. "Elizabeth?" he breathed. The woman looked up, her eyes widening as they landed on Harrison. A sound escaped her, a high, keening cry of disbelief and agony. "Harry! Oh, God! Harry!" tore through the night like a physical blow. Harrison dropped to his knees, his good arm reaching out to pull the woman into a fierce, trembling embrace. They huddled there in the dirt, 2 broken pieces of a shattered past suddenly forced back together. "I thought you were dead," Harrison sobbed into her hair. "The fire. I saw the house go down. I thought everyone was inside." "He took me!" Elizabeth cried, her voice muffled against his chest. Silas. He dragged me out the back window before he set the match. He told me you were dead. He told me he was saving me. He kept me in a house in San Francisco for years, then brought me here when he started the company. I was his trophy, his secret. Josephine watched them, her heart breaking for the years of lies that had kept these two apart. Harrison had been mourning a ghost, and Elizabeth had been living in a nightmare fueled by the man who had destroyed their home. Elizabeth pulled back, her shaking hands fumbling with the leather satchel. I found them, Harry. The ledgers, the real deeds. Silas keeps a second set of books in the floorboards of his office. I waited until he left with his men today. I took his fastest mule and ran. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume and a sheaf of papers. Josephine leaned in, the moonlight illuminating the pages. It wasn't just a ledger, it was a confession. There, in Silas Thorne's own handwriting, were the records of every administrative correction he had ever made. There were the names of the men he had hired to set fires in Texas, the bribes paid to the sheriff in Randsburg, and, most importantly, the original, unadulterated deed for the sleeping water, signed by the territorial governor himself. "This is it," Josephine whispered, her fingers brushing the ink. "This is the truth." "It's his death warrant," Harrison said, his voice cold and hard as a winter frost. He looked at his sister, his eyes burning with a new, lethal purpose. "He didn't just steal our land, Elizabeth. He stole your life. He's not getting another minute of it." "He's coming, Harry," Elizabeth said, her eyes wide with terror. "He'll have seen the wagon was gone. He'll know exactly where I went." "Let him come," Harrison said, standing up. He looked at Josephine, a silent communication passing between them. They were no longer just defending a dream. They were exacting justice for a decade of blood and fire. "Josephine," Harrison said, his voice steady, "can you drive that buckboard?" "I can," she said. "Take Elizabeth. Take the ledgers. Ride for the Thompson Ranch. Robert has friends in the U.S. Marshal's office in Sacramento. If you can get these papers to them, Silas Thorne is finished." "And you?" Josephine asked, her heart hammering. Harrison picked up the Winchester, his left hand gripping it with a ferocity that defied his injury. He looked at the granite ridge, at the water that was still singing in the dark. "I'm going to stay here and greet an old friend," he said. "I've got 17 years of fire to put out." "No," Josephine said, stepping into his space. She took the rifle from his hand and looked him in the eye. "We don't leave each other, Harrison. That was the deal. Elizabeth takes the buckboard. You and I, we finish this together." The sound of hoofbeats echoed from the south. Closer this time. Faster. Silas Thorne was coming. And he wasn't coming for land anymore. He was coming to bury the evidence of his sins. Josephine handed the satchel to Elizabeth and helped her back onto the buckboard. "Go, don't stop until you see the Thompson gates." As the wagon disappeared into the darkness, Josephine turned to Harrison. She picked up the Winchester and he drew his Colt. They stood side by side at the edge of the sleeping water, the moonlight casting long, defiant shadows over the land they had bled for. The serpent was coming, but for the first time in her life, Josephine Bennett wasn't afraid. She had found her water. She had found her family, and she was ready to burn the world down to protect them. The moon was a cold silver eye watching the desert as Silas Thorne and his men rode into the valley. They didn't come with shouts. They came with the rhythmic, terrifying thud of horses hell-bent on destruction. In the distance, the dust from Elizabeth's buckboard was a fading ghost, but here the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and impending iron. "Stay behind the wagon wheel, Joe," Harrison whispered. He was kneeling in the mud of the newly formed creek, his left hand gripping the Winchester. His fever had broken, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "If they get past me, you run for the ridge. Don't look back." "I'm not a runner anymore, Harrison," Josephine replied. She stood in the dark mouth of the dugout, the Colt peacemaker heavy in her hand. "We stand together." The riders slowed as they reached the edge of the sleeping water. The dark, spreading pool had turned the salt flats into a quagmire, a black mirror reflecting the stars. Silas Thorne sat atop his black stallion, his face pale with a fury that transcended greed. "Where is she, Trent?" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the granite walls. "Where's the girl in the ledgers?" "She's halfway to justice, Silas," Harrison called back. "And you're exactly where you belong, at the end of the trail." Silas didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and the night exploded. Gunfire flared like orange lightning. Bullets hissed into the mud and splintered the wood of the wagon. Harrison fired back, his left hand working the lever of the Winchester with a frantic rhythmic grace. He wasn't aiming for the men, he was aiming for the horses. He needed to break their charge. A horse went down, screaming, throwing its rider into the slush. The scarred man, Thorne's right hand, leapt from his saddle and sprinted toward the dugout, his revolver barking. Josephine saw him coming. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, sharp focus. She raised the Colt, bracing her wrist with her left hand, and fired. The recoil jarred her arm, but the scarred man stumbled, his shoulder blossoming red. He fell into the stream, the water Thomas had dreamed of now washing away the filth of a murderer. "Harrison, to the left!" Josephine screamed. Silas had dismounted, using the chaos to circle the ridge. He appeared from the shadows, his face a mask of aristocratic hate. He fired, the bullet grazing Harrison's ribs. Harrison tumbled back into the mud, the Winchester slipping from his grasp. Silas stepped over the stream, his polished boots sinking into the dark earth. He pointed his pistol at Harrison's head. "I should have burned you in that barn 5 years ago, boy. You've been a thorn in my side for too long." "Then finish it," Harrison wheezed, his left hand surreptitiously reaching for the small, sharp rock he had hidden in his palm. "With pleasure." But Silas never pulled the trigger. A shadow moved from the dugout. Josephine didn't fire the gun. She didn't want to risk hitting Harrison. Instead, she swung the heavy iron skillet she had been clutching, the same one she had used to cook Harrison's first meal at the ranch. She swung with every ounce of strength she had. Every bit of grief she had turned into power. The heavy iron connected with the back of Silas's head with a sickening thud. The king of Ransburg crumpled into the mud like a suit of empty clothes. His pistol fired harmlessly into the air as he lost consciousness, his face landing face down in the sleeping water. Harrison lunged forward, his good hand grabbing Silas by the collar and hauling his head out of the water. He didn't want him to drown. Not yet. He wanted him to face the law Elizabeth was bringing. The remaining 2 henchmen, seeing their leader defeated by a cowboy and a helpless widow, turned their horses and fled into the darkness. They were men who followed power, and Silas Thorne had none left. The silence returned, broken only by the steady, beautiful gurgle of the spring. Josephine dropped the skillet and collapsed beside Harrison. They sat in the mud, drenched in water and blood, gasping for air. Harrison reached out with his left hand and pulled her into his chest. "You hit him with a frying pan," Harrison breathed, a ragged, incredulous laugh escaping his throat. "It was closer than the rifle," Josephine sobbed, half laughing, half crying. They looked out over the 40 acres. The moon was setting, and the first hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky. The water was still flowing, carving a path toward a future that was no longer a lie. "We did it, Joe," Harrison whispered, kissing her forehead. "We filled the wagon." 17 years later. The Trent Ranch was no longer a boneyard. It was a sanctuary of green. The 40 acres were covered in waving fields of alfalfa, and a sprawling garden that boasted the largest pumpkins in the territory. The granite ridge was now crowned by a sturdy 2-story house with a wraparound porch, where honeysuckle climbed the pillars, and the smell of baking bread drifted on the breeze. Josephine stood in the garden, her hair now touched with a few elegant threads of silver, her hands strong and calloused, from a life well lived. She looked out at the horizon, watching her eldest son, James, now a man of 17 with his father's jaw and Thomas's dreaming eyes, working a young horse in the corral. Her daughter, Anna, was sitting on the porch steps, buried in a book, while young Henry chased a wagging dog through the tall grass. Harrison approached from the barn. walking with a slight limp and carrying a mended harness. His right arm was stiff. It would never be what it once was, but it was strong enough to hold his wife every night. "The creek is running high today," Harrison said, stepping beside her. He wrapped his good arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Margaret would have loved to see this garden, Joe." "She saw it in us, Harrison," Josephine replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "She told me once that we saved each other. I didn't believe her then. I do now." Their peace was interrupted by the sound of a wagon. They both turned, their instincts still sharp after all these years. A lone wagon was crawling up the trail from the south. It was battered, the canvas cover torn, the horse staggering with exhaustion. As it drew closer, they saw the driver. It was a young woman, barely 20, her face streaked with dust and tears. Her shoulders were slumped with the unmistakable weight of a soul that had reached its breaking point. Harrison and Josephine exchanged a look. No words were needed. It was a mirror held up to the past. They walked down to the trail together. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the young woman looked down at them, her eyes wide with a desperate, flickering hope. "I'm lost," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. "My husband. He died 3 days back. I have nothing left. I don't know where to go." Josephine reached up, her hand steady and warm as she took the girl's trembling fingers. "You're not lost, dear," Josephine said, her voice a soothing balm. "My name is Josephine Trent. This is my husband, Harrison. You're at the Sleeping Water now." Harrison tipped his hat, his blue-green eyes filled with a deep, ancient understanding. "Come down from there, miss. We've got plenty of food, a warm bed, and a place for you to catch your breath. You're safe." The girl, Elizabeth Morrison, as they would soon learn, looked at the thriving ranch, the playing children, and the two people standing before her like twin pillars of strength. She allowed Josephine to help her down, the first sob of relief breaking through her armor. As they walked her toward the house, Harrison looked at Josephine and smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held 17 years of devotion. "The wagon was empty, Harrison," Josephine whispered, echoing the thought she'd had so long ago. "Not anymore, Joe," Harrison replied, tightening his grip on her hand. "It's never empty as long as someone is riding beside it." The sun set over the California hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The water continued to sing, the garden continued to grow, and on a porch built from grief and fire, a new story of hope was beginning to be written. The circle was complete. The prairie had been crossed, and no one ever again would have to walk it alone. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more journeys across the frontier of the human heart. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
As the dust settles over the wide, unforgiving prairie, what remains is not just the story of a woman, a cowboy, or a piece of land. It is the quiet, enduring echo of what it truly means to live, to love, and to rise again when everything has been stripped away. This journey was never only about survival. It was about transformation. Josephine began as a woman hollowed out by grief, a widow with nothing left but memories and a fading road ahead. But the land that seemed determined to break her instead revealed something deeper, something unshakable. It taught her that loss does not define the end of a life. It often marks the beginning of a new one. And sometimes, the greatest strength is not in fighting the world, but in choosing to keep moving forward when the world gives you every reason to stop. Through Harrison, we are reminded that pain leaves scars, but those scars can become the very reason we stand beside someone else in their darkest hour. He did not save Josephine because he was strong. He stood by her because he understood what it meant to be broken. And in that shared understanding, something rare and powerful was born, a bond not built on perfection, but on truth, resilience, and quiet compassion. Their connection shows us that love in its truest form is not about replacing the past, but about honoring it while choosing to build something new. It is about standing beside someone not because it is easy, but because it is right. This story also reminds us that not all battles are fought with guns or fists. Some of the hardest battles are fought within, against doubt, fear, betrayal, and the weight of what we have lost. Josephine faced all of these, and yet she chose not to surrender. Even when the land appeared barren, when the truth about her husband shook her faith, and when danger closed in from every side, she kept going. And in doing so, she discovered what many never do, that hope is not something you are given. It is something you create, often with your own hands, in the harshest conditions imaginable. Perhaps the most powerful message this story leaves us with is that people, like the land, are not always what they first appear to be. What looks like a wasteland may be hiding a spring beneath the surface. What seems like the end may be the beginning of something greater. And what feels like unbearable loss may carry within it the seeds of a future we cannot yet see. Josephine's journey teaches us to look deeper, to trust that even in the darkest moments, there is something worth holding on to, whether it is love, purpose, or simply the will to keep going. In the end, the true victory was never just the land, or the water, or even the defeat of a man like Silas Thorne. The true victory was in reclaiming life itself, in choosing compassion over bitterness, courage over fear, and connection over isolation. It was in building a home not just from wood and soil, but from trust, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. And perhaps most importantly, it was in ensuring that no one who came after them would have to walk that lonely road alone. So as you step away from this story, carry this with you. No matter how harsh your circumstances may seem, there is always a way forward. No matter how broken you feel, there is still strength within you waiting to rise. And no matter how empty the road may appear, it only takes one moment, one connection, one act of kindness to change everything. Because in the vast, unpredictable landscape of life, the greatest truth remains: hope is never truly lost. It is only waiting to be found.